Hi everybody, it's Tim once again. This is a second demo based on the poetry paper that we're currently writing. In the first demonstration I talked about paraphrase and its relationship to understanding what's going on in a poem. So in other words, describing the action, who is doing what, where are they doing it, trying to account for all those details, simply to understand and restate in our own words. In the next stage of your thinking, what you want to start doing is taking those ideas from your paraphrase and thinking to yourself, how do I know? How has the writer suggested these things? What words stood out to me in individual lines? What ideas stood out to me? And what sorts of poetic techniques are being used to suggest ideas to me? So in the poem Medusa, I would argue that imagery plays a key role. I think the idea of paradox, in other words, opposing opposites. One thing is true while at the same time an equally powerful and opposite idea is true. And I think Bogan explores these things through the perspective of a speaker who encounters Medusa, is turned to stone, and is thrown into this state of frozenness, right? He's a statue or something, frozen in stone. And he is forced to contemplate for all eternity what he has seen and what it's done to him and how it will never change. The tone of the poem is not like depressed or frightened or angry or anything like that. It's very flat and neutral, possibly even resigned. But the speaker seems to be replaying the memory and what's in front of him frozen forever, over and over. And so the eternity of this, seeing the same thing over and over, is a type of hell. So if you want to look at this poem in sort of a frightening way, you'd say, while he's caught up on a pretty pleasant summer day, and he's seeing all these things like water about to fall, and a bell about to ring, and dust about to rise in the air, it never quite gets to do it. So these actions are never fulfilled. His motion, his completion of his life is never fulfilled. And so it seems to me to be sort of kind of an image of hell, or at least torment. Anyway, my interpretation of the poem, though, before I can actually make that statement, has to come out of individual observations. How do I know that? Where do I see that? So you're probably saying to yourself, I read that poem, I don't agree. That's absolutely fine. You're entitled to your own interpretation. Well, here's mine. I looked at the first stanza and I began to look at certain ideas. So I was interested, for example, in the first person pronoun, the speaker, who is the I. And then we have other images of the house. Not a very descript image. It doesn't say red house, for example, or bungalow. So the imagery, interestingly enough, is very restrained. Cave of trees, however, is a much more descript phrase and a little bit more elusive. How are trees like a cave? They seem to be shading or covering something. And then we had that line about facing a sheer sky. And if you recall, the word sheer is what interested me because it seems to have multiple meanings. The other thing I noted was that imagery of motion and the sun arcing or wheeling by struck me as very interesting. So here's my comment. First thing I noticed was imagery. The house is inside a cave of trees and it faces the sheer sky. My interpretation is that Bogan is describing the contrast of a secluded spot of darkness on a sunny, cloudless day, the sheer sky, as well as the contrast of experiencing time as fast-moving, and perhaps the sun is even traveling as an arc. In other words, imagine the sun is kind of on a wheel, right? And what we see during the daylight, right, is the sun arcing through the sky from sunrise to sunset. Both the speed and the shape of time are suggested by the word wheeled. Time appears to roll forward and is marked by the rising and setting sun, which appears to follow an arc across the sky. So I am starting to believe that the theme is related to time, or the experience of time in the present and in memory. The first two stanzas are a memory, which is signified by the by the past tense. Excuse me, I've got a little typo there. When the experiences are described by an I narrator in the past tense, then these experiences are most likely memories. So you'll notice that my commentary here is me talking to myself. This is not a finished draft. This is me trying to pull apart the individual observations I've made about what I think these things mean. So of course I'll be required to revise these things if I retain them in my paper. but I am trying to kind of shape up, like, what's this paper going to talk about? I really haven't decided at this point. I'm merely making these observations and trying to come away with, what do these things mean? Let's look at the second stanza together. When the bare eyes were before me, and the hissing hair held up at a window, seen through a door, the stiff bald eyes, the serpents on the forehead, formed in the air. So here's my commentary. In stanza 2, the imagery of memory is described as the speaker looks into the house through a doorway and a window. Both doors and windows are thresholds between exterior and interior details. Medusa is inside and the speaker is outside looking in. Again, there is a contrast of details which, while part of the same thing, are also opposed to each other. Perhaps it is the tension between the opposites that gives definition to things and experiences. This is a dead scene forever now. Nothing will ever stir. The end will never brighten it more than this, nor the rain blur. In stanza 3, the speaker's perspective changes. And I noted this in my paraphrase too. The past tense dominates the first two stanzas. The present tense dominates the rest of the poem. So the next two stanzas are in the present tense. This shift in perspective is also a contrast of past with present. The speaker notes that the scene is dead forever, and this statement is reinforced by some of that nondescript imagery of a lack of motion. There's no increase in light. There's no chance of rain ever obscuring this scene. Thus, Bogan, seems to suggest that death is a frozen eternity without the tension of opposites to give it further meaning or development. The water will always fall and will not fall, and the tipped bell make no sound. The grass will always be growing for hay deep on the ground. My comment here is that the speaker seems to note the paradox of actions without conclusions. Caught in an eternity where the motion of things is frozen, the speaker seems aware of the unfulfilled potential or inertia of these things. And I shall stand here like a shadow under the great balanced day, my eyes on the yellow dust that was lifting on the wind and does not drift away. In this concluding stanza, the speaker speaks in 3 verb tenses. First, she imagines herself in the future. I shall stand here. In other words, she's thinking about how every day is the same, and I'll be here tomorrow and the day afterward and so forth. And she also uses a simile to describe the way she'll be standing, like a shadow, somehow like a reflection or an impression created from a scene that froze him or her in that place. Shadows indicate some sort of barrier between the sun and the ground. They are not the thing itself, but an image of the thing that lacks its material properties. They're ephemeral. A shadow is also like a photographic negative in the darkness that gives definition to things in the light, and vice versa. The speaker is conscious of being in this permanently frozen state, and like a shadow is dependent on light for definition and serves as a contrast to light. Perhaps another paradox, darkness existing in the light. If the sun was at its high point at noon, when the speaker arrives on the scene at the beginning of the poem, then the image of a balanced day may suggest this. I'm referring here to the line balanced day, I'm sorry. If the sun is a symbol of time, then it is the middle of its arc, halfway between sunrise and sunset, or in the middle of time, corresponding with the verb tenses past, present, and future. So perhaps the sun has been a symbol, perhaps the sun has been an image of time, and that we live our lives, for example, in the daylight, using time, passing of time as sort of an arc. But if it's a balanced day, then perhaps Bogan is implying midday in the present, with the past behind us and the future in front of us. I don't know if you agree, but that's what I'm going with. If the sun is a symbol of time, then it is the middle of its arc, halfway between sunrise and sunset, or in the middle of time, or corresponding with the verb tenses past, present, and future. The speaker is caught in an everlasting present, in contrast with his or her memories of the past or speculations about the future, which will not change for him or her. So, it appears that we are inside the speaker's mind as she contemplates her eternity, which, while not altogether unpleasant looking, is ultimately hell because it will be this way forever, and the speaker is powerless to change it. Perhaps that's why the tone of this poem seems unemotional. The speaker has been this way for quite some time and has now accepted his or her situation, having to replay the horror of his or her transformation over and over again to arrive at the same moment of stasis. Conversely, this poem could be about how to resist becoming frozen by animating one's perspective through multiple perspectives in time. Or it could be a poem about memories and how they are like frozen objects awaiting reanimation when we meditate on them. So you'll notice that at this point of my thinking, I was not decided on what I wanted to argue about this poem in my paper. There's lots of possibilities, and for a very small poem, I was able to make some fairly hefty observations by looking at the words and thinking carefully through what they meant. Here is my rough introduction for my essay. So if I were going to make a paper out of this poem, here's what I would say in my introduction to set up that paper, to set up that discussion. In her poem, Medusa, Louise Bogan retells the Medusa story from the perspective of one of Medusa's victims, who has been turned to stone and must now contemplate forever what he has seen and how it has led him to this frozen state. As such, the speaker seems resigned to his destiny as he gazes upon a few images of unfulfilled action. Bogan implies, through her use of imagery and paradox, how the speaker had neglected to notice the various tensions of opposites that defined, animated, and enriched his life when he limited himself to a narrow interpretation of reality through his self-centeredness or oversimplification of the situation. Thus, this poem stands as warning to be open to the complexity and possibility of any situation, or else suffer an eternity of isolation, regretting a lesson learned too late. That's a rough introduction. I'm sure it needs a lot of work. But what I've done is I've set myself up for a paper by committing to specific observations and identifying some of the poetic techniques, those terms that we've been discussing in class, that are in our textbook, that were in the list of terms that I distributed to you. And I've isolated what I think are the primary ones. There's other ideas in here, but these are the ones I'm going to look at most frequently, is this imagery and paradox. The other thing I've done by proceeding this way, separating my paraphrase from my interpretation and by identifying commentary for myself, is I've given myself some content, some rough ideas for the individual paragraphs, and I've already placed them into an order, commenting in order on the stanzas as the poem develops. In other words, I've given myself a structure. So if I were going to create an outline out of this, what I could simply do is take my rough introduction and all of my comment paragraphs and recopy them in the order they appear here. So that way, I would have my introduction and say 3 or 4 or 5 rough ideas for my paragraphs that will follow. This will set me up to write an essay and to choose which quotations I want to include in my poem. My analysis of my poem. So that's how I'd like you to proceed after you've got your paraphrase done, is go back to your poem, begin looking at individual stanzas, lines, words, trying to determine how the poet has suggested certain ideas to you through her or his use of poetic technique, connotations of words, and you have to kind of make a decision as you go. And don't think that an interpretation is going to come to mind immediately. Allow yourself to process the entire poem, and at the end, do what I did, and that is some free writing about what does all this add up to? What does it all mean? What does it seem to be suggesting in terms of a theme? Okay? I hope this has been a helpful demonstration, and please, once again, if you have questions or comments, please get back in touch with me or email me drafts of your papers in progress. Take care.